grip of oppression. I fought for my liberty. I paid with the blood of my people. Freedom has never been free. Now my door's always open to dreamers and friends. When I'm attacked, I protect and defend, because my name is America. I stand proud.
Our speaker for tonight, Sean Riley, is the state director of Liberty Seed. He's more than that. I'm going to let him actually get in and describe the various parts of Liberty Seed, and another thing that he does is Appleseed. But Sean is one of many across the nation who spend their time, their travels, their monies to communicate, to propagate, if you will, the founding principles and the things that made our nation great. I don't want to get too much into the story, but the story really speaks to the kind of courage and the sacrifice that the founders of our nation exhibited and gave us the reason that we can be here tonight. And then I can have this microphone and we can speak about the things that we can, because we have the First Amendment. Sean lives in Blooming Prairie with his wife and 3 kids. They're a very active family, but Sean spends a lot of time on the road and very dedicated to this cause. So we thank them for allowing him to do that work, of course. But Sean, come up.
Good evening to all of you. Good evening. Thank you for having me here this evening. I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes of who I am and why I'm here. My day job, I work for a large blue healthcare center, not too far away. Most of you probably know. I took that job 10 years ago for the purposes of wanting to help other people. I left a better paying job because I thought that I could give something of myself to others. About 4 years ago, I was introduced to this program, the Liberty Seed program and the Appleseed program. And at those programs, I heard people speak from the heart about what our forefathers did to give us the rights and the liberties that we have today. And I was inspired by that speech. I was inspired to the point that I wanted to be able to help tell others those stories. So what I'm here tonight is to tell you the stories that I have learned the same way that you would have heard them back in 1775. From my mouth to your ears. Passed down from my heart, the way I've learned these stories, the passion that I have behind them. So I thank you for your time here this evening. I'll spend about the next hour telling you about the day our nation was born. A bloody butchery. A bloody butchery of your countrymen. 49 of our fellow citizens cut down, murdered for defending their homes. On April the 19th, 1775, what we're doing right now was illegal. We don't have King George's signature to say that we are allowed to sit here together and speak. We don't have one of King George's magistrates here to give us that permission either. In 1775, there's no freedom of the press. In 1775, someone in a nice red coat came to your home and said, "Wow, you have a very nice house. Get out." That was perfectly legal. Quartering acts. the intolerable acts. 5 years after the Boston Massacre, in which 11 Americans were cut down there as well, and all of the redcoats found not guilty of any crime. On this night, fateful night for our nation, King George has decided that the American colonists have become too much of a problem. They have become rabble-rousers. They are not paying their taxes. They are causing all sorts of problems with goods. They're throwing the tea in the harbor. So he's decided to do something about it. He sent word to General Thomas Gage, military magistrate of the colony of Massachusetts. He sent word to him to go forth into the countryside and seize the arms of the colonists and find himself a pair of rabble-rousers, John Hancock and Samuel Adams. Interesting enough, that the opening battle of revolution for this country was due to an act of gun control. General Thomas Gage will tell two individuals about his orders from the king. The first is Colonel Smith, the man given the right and the need to go out through the day and carry on the day's activities. The second is his wife, Margaret. We often talk about the founding fathers. Always hear about the founding fathers. Very rarely do we ever talk about the founding mothers. Margaret Gage is absolutely one of the founding mothers of our nation. Margaret Gage was born in the colonies. She was a patriot. She had seen the powder raids over the last several months. She knew that people were going to be hurt, and she knew that the colonists would be unable to defend themselves if her husband took all of their weapons. She sent word to her personal physician, Dr. Joseph Warren. Dr. Joseph Warren was a high Son of Liberty. Most of you have probably heard of the Sons of Liberty, and many of you have heard of the day, the night of Paul Revere's ride. Anybody here heard of Paul Revere? Throw some hands up. All right. Here's one. Let's see how many people are listening. My kids can't answer this one, by the way. How many of you have heard of William Dawes? If I had a t-shirt cannon, I'd be throwing them out. On this night, the night will go down in history, written in a poem that was written 80 years later in 1862 about the American Civil War, not about the night of the Revolution. It will say, Paul Revere rode upon the countryside yelling, what? The British are coming, the British are coming. That's interesting because that's like me standing in Austin yelling, the Minnesotans are coming. We were all British. At this point in history, if you read the men and the women who wrote about this time in history, all the way from 1775 all the way up until 1861, they didn't refer this to as the Revolutionary War. They referred it to as a civil war. Father against son, mother against father. We were fighting against England, our mother. On this night, Dr. Joseph Warren will take the message that he has received from Margaret Gage, and he will pass that along. Margaret Gage has made a choice. She has made the decision to put her life on the line for those of her countrymen. Margaret Gage will pay the price. Within the next week, her husband, discovering that she is the person who has leaked this, will put her on a ship and send her back to England. She will never see her husband or her children again. She will die in England, where he has her moved from a marked grave to an unmarked grave later. Dr. Joseph Warren will go to two individuals, Paul Revere, and the name that no one ever knows except for a couple of people tonight, William Dawes. Paul Revere will indeed send word to a 14-year-old boy to go to the North Church in Boston. And in the North Church in Boston, they will indeed put up the lanterns, one if by land, two if by sea. They will hang 2 lanterns, for the British are coming across the channel from Boston. William Dawes is actually the person who gets on the horse. He gets on the horse and he rides south, outside of Boston. Can I get my map helpers, please? Come on, map helpers. Come on, guys. Hold it high. Hold it high. Sorry for folks that this is a smaller map, but for those of you who are familiar with Boston, it's basically an island in 1775. Today, Boston covers everything out here. But at this time, Boston was basically an island with a small stretch of land, about 3 miles wide, that connected it back to the mainland. Thanks, guys. Actually, why don't you walk the map over there? Those folks can see. William Dawes will get on a horse and he will make the first ride. His purpose is not to go place to place, countryside to countryside, yelling, "The British are coming." Of course not. That would be silly. We were all British. What indeed does he say? What is his message? The regulars are out. The regular army is out. And those regulars are out. And he is the first alarm lister leaving Boston, heading towards what today we call Battle Road, the cities of Lexington, Concord, out to the west. And on his mission, his first priority is not actually to go to every town. Go ahead, guys, you can put them down. His first mission is actually to go and warn those 2 gentlemen, John Hancock and Samuel Adams. Paul Revere actually has the same mission. And he doesn't first jump on a horse. He actually gets in a boat. He gets himself in a canoe. And he leaves the same way that the regulars will leave. He goes out the north side of Boston, and he starts to row towards the mainland. And as he rows, the wind starts to pick up. The tides start to push him over. And he finds himself directly next to one of the most powerful warships in North America, the HMS Somerset. Some would say this is luck. Others say by the grace of God. The Somerset will be here. Paul Revere will be here. And the moon is on this side. The shadow cast by the moon covers his little canoe as he rows by. He writes in his own memoirs later that he could clearly hear the men on board the ship speaking as he went by. Paul Revere will get himself to the mainland. And at the mainland, he finds himself a white horse by the name of Brown Beauty. He gets on to his horse and he begins his ride. Again, not to tell everyone that the British are coming, but to tell them the regulars are out. And his first priority is to go again and find those 2 gentlemen. At this very same time, Colonel Smith has received his orders. He's received orders to take 1,100 soldiers out onto Battle Road, to march them out and again seize the arms of the militia, to seize the arms of the colonists. Primarily, their powder. He wakes his men up at about 1 in the morning. They're unruly. He puts them all into canoes and he says, go to the mainland, but he doesn't tell them why. When they start getting in their canoes to be able to go over to the mainland, they find that for 1,100 men, they only have 20 canoes. They have to take those 20 canoes and start going back and forth and back and forth. Trying to expedite their process, they take them in, and as they get close to shore, they dump them overboard. So these men who have now been woken up at 1 in the morning now find themselves soaking wet up to their armpits, holding their muskets above their head as they try to tromp up onto the shore. Colonel Smith gets about 300 men across, and he decides it's just simply going to take too long. He'll never have a surprise if he has to move everyone across. It'll take too long. So he decides to break his men into two groups. He will take a gentleman by the name of Major Pitcairn. Colonel Smith and Major Pitcairn will take the first 300 men, and they will then be followed by those 800 behind. They start their march out, as our map showed, westward, towards Lexington. Major Pitcairn is the second in command of these first 300 men. Major Pitcairn has an opinion of the American colonists. He believes that they are no better than beasts of burden. He believes the only purpose to have them in his army is to construct tents, to haul things, and to simply be better than a mule. At the end of the day, he will have a different opinion. Colonel Smith and his men begin their march westward. As they do this, Paul Revere and William Dawes, who have quite a bit of a head start on them, who are also on horseback. Most of the regulars are on foot. Paul Revere and William Dawes will meet up with the two rabble-rousers, Samuel Adams, John Hancock. They meet them, and at that point they say, "You've got to go. The regulars are up. They're coming for you." And of course these two gentlemen say, "No, we're staying." They're making a choice. They want to stay. They want to defend their lands. They choose that they're not going to run. After almost an hour of arguing between the men, they finally said, "No, you're too important to the cause, you must go." And they go. Where do they go? Upward. Now, from this point, is where the alarm listers begin. Town to town, place to place. They get on a horse, they ride to the next community, they ride to the next farm. They ring the bells of the community, the church bells. They yell at the top of their lungs. They start rattling people out of their beds. When they get to those next communities, those communities have men who have been designated to get on their horse and ride out. In 1775, this is the closest thing you get to the internet. Person to person, person to person, person to person, as quickly as their feet or their horse could carry them, town to town. And throughout the day, they will do something amazing. Just before dawn, Colonel Smith, Major Pitcairn, and his 300 regulars begin their march up to the outskirts of Lexington. Sitting in Lexington are 70 men, about the same number as we have in here. The 70 men are under the command of Captain Jonathan Parker. Captain Jonathan Parker is a veteran of the French and Indian Wars. He's a landowner. He owns about 50 acres. He has a family. He doesn't need to come to fight. He's put in his time. He's done his duty for his nation before. But that morning, he's there. Something else. He has tuberculosis. In 2014, for those of you familiar with the Big Blue Hospital over here, tuberculosis is very nasty. It is an incredibly nasty disease today. In 1775, it was a slow death sentence. He made the choice to risk his farm, his family, his health, and his life to go to that field and stand. 70 men are also on that field, and he puts them into formation. Who are those 70 men? Some of them are veterans. None of them are soldiers. They're fishermen. They're woodsmen. They're lawyers. They're community leaders. They're rope makers. They're farmers. They're not soldiers. They're people of the community. When they line up, they look something like this group right here. Dressed a little more like me, but a whole lot like you. They brought whatever clothes they had, wearing their Sunday best, or whatever they happened to have on them at the time. Different colors, different cuts, different shapes, different sizes. They're not an army. With them, they have brought whatever they have for arms. Something similar to this, probably. Standard frontiersman's musket. This would shoot anything from 32 caliber to 75 caliber, just depended on how much I could shove in it. All dependent on how much powder I happen to have. As my powder goes, let's see, about that much. Whatever I had on hand, my shot, whatever I could fit in my bag. Here I've got 4 rounds. If I had 4 shot, that's what I came to that field with. If I had 20 and I could fit it in my bag, I brought the 20. Whatever I have. The people standing on Lexington Green were there defending their homes and their country. Colonel Smith will ride in just at sundown from the rear of his army. Captain Parker will have his men form up on the Lexington Green. Colonel Smith's men, at this point, under the command of a young lieutenant, will start to move towards their line. First 5, then 5 to the right, 5 to the left, 5 more to both sides, 25 across. Very quickly, Captain Parker realizes that he is vastly outnumbered. And yet he stands. The regulars will march up no further in distance than from me to the camera. Almost close enough to be able to spit on each other. They will line up nice and orderly, all in the same uniform, red jackets, white stripes, big fuzzy black hats, using the same rifles and muskets. They all line up. They are the most powerful army in the world in 1775. These are not rookies. These are men who have fought in Europe. These are men who have fought the French, fought and won. They expect little to nothing for resistance from these colonial rabble. As they form up, Captain Parker sees what he's up against. And yet he stands. In fact, he has an order. He says, "Stand your ground. Do not fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to start a war, let it begin here." Captain Parker's men line. The British line against them. And that same young lieutenant officer on a horse rides up in between them quickly. And he yells, "Disperse! Disperse, you damn rebels! Lay down your arms and disperse!" Captain Parker, he's a veteran, a soldier, a patriot. He's made that decision, but he's not stupid. He's outnumbered 5 to 1. He has militia. They have soldiers. He, in fact, does order his men to disperse. They take their arms and they turn, and they begin to walk away from the field. He orders them to disperse. He did not tell them to lay down their arms. A single shot rings out. Today we call it the shot heard round the world. Whether by accident or on purpose, a single round is fired. The British column, without orders, opens fire on the Americans. Quickly, the Americans are all apart. 17 colonists will lay dead or dying on that field over the next few minutes. 8 pairs of fathers and sons stood at the Lexington Green. 5 are separated by death. 17 colonists. One of them will live just long enough to crawl to his own doorstep and die on his own porch in front of his wife. Colonel Smith's men start to break apart. They act more like a mob than an army at this point. They break apart and they start busting into homes. They start to raid. Well, Colonel Smith is again at the rear of his army, gets on his horse, he runs to the front. He rides to the front quickly. He is a good British officer. He is in control of an army, not a mob. He has his men run their drums to come back to formation. Run the drums, and the British will very quickly find themselves, through instinct, moving out of the homes and back to the center of their lines. Well, Colonel Smith wants to make sure that they keep their spirits up, so he has them give salute to the king. Take off their hats. Huzzah! 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 3 salutes to good King George. Celebrating the butchery of their own country. We call this the first strike of the match. Take an old stick match. You hit it once. It doesn't like it. You hit it twice. It doesn't like it. You hit it a third time. It bursts into fire. At this point, Colonel Smith's officers, almost all of them to a T, will come to him and tell him they must withdraw. They must go back to Boston. They said these were not our orders. Our orders were to seize, not kill. Colonel Smith, however, has been given his orders and he intends to carry them out. He will march forward. He lines up his men and he begins the march towards Concord. In 1775, there's no text messaging, there's no television, there's no radio. Their landlines sucked. The only forms of communication that they had were writing and mouth to ears. Some men will jump on horseback and leave Lexington, heading westwards, trying to get around the regular column in an attempt to tell Concord what's happening. But for the most part, Concord only knows the message that came out that early morning. The regulars are out. Colonel Smith will take his men and start their march westward, another 8 miles from Lexington towards Concord. And as they get about halfway through their march, they notice a bunch of children. A bunch of them in here. Kids, stand up. Anybody who counts themselves as a kid, go ahead, stand up. Even Jim. All the kids. The regulars march on by, and they see a bunch of kids between about the ages of 7 and 12 standing on the side of the road, and kids are waving at them. Hi. Right? The regulars, for the most part, just ignore them. Once in a while, they get a nice wave back, but for the most part, they just ignore the children. The children standing on the side of the road are the ones who have actually plowed into the ground all of the arms that the regulars are out that day looking for, directly in the field behind them. And they wave as the regulars go by. Go ahead, kids, sit up. If you've ever heard the saying, when it's time to bury your guns, it's time to dig them up again, this is where that comes from. So in Concord, they don't have a lot of information. They don't know entirely what has happened at Lexington. They have conflicting stories. But the alarm listers have done their job. They are going from community to community across the sides of New England, and people are pouring in. And sitting in Concord at this time is a large group of men, again, who have brought everything with them that they could find. Whatever they may have. Something like this, a 1766 Charleville, something like my Frontier rifle. Either way. Those men have broken themselves into three main groups. The very young men, the more middle-aged men, and the very experienced men. The very young men want to go and fight. Let's engage. Let's fight. The more middle-aged men want to wait for reinforcements. And the yet more elderly men want to learn more about what has happened before they make any decisions. So in good New England style, and probably what we do in Minnesota too, they did all three. So the very young men will take up their muskets, line themselves in good order, and they start marching. And as they march forward, they will see the redcoats in the distance, and all of a sudden go, no, no, no. They turn themselves around and start heading themselves right back to Concord. These men were not easily scared. They saw something they didn't expect. What they saw were these Charleville rifles and others like them with the very nastiest weapon of 1775 on top. About an 18-inch long bayonet. 300 men, bayonets attached, marching up the road. They later describe it as the red serpent, or the dragon's teeth, as they could see all the bayonets gleaming in the sun. These little buggers were made the length that they are specifically so that they could go through a man and stick out the back. That way they knew they got you. They also made them triangular in shape. And they made them triangular in shape because the medical science of the day said a triangular wound would not heal. The young men will march themselves in good order back to Concord. And when they find themselves into Concord, we find that the other two groups of men have, for the most part, withdrawn. They were drawn to the northwest of town out to Punkatasset Hill. They will then also go to Punkatasset Hill. And who did they leave left in the town? All the ladies. Colonel Smith will enter Concord unopposed. When he gets into Concord, he will begin his mission. Rabble about, break into houses, look for contraband. Papers we don't like, things that make us angry, stuff we might steal, whatever it may be. And they start taking that contraband and they pile it into the center of town. They chop down the Liberty pole and they put that into the center of town. They go to a local innkeeper, one of the few men who are left in town, and assume that obviously since he's still there, he must be part of the militia. And they bust down his door. And they ask him, "Where are the cannon?" What cannon? They knock him to the ground. They take a musket, they plop it to his forehead, and they say, "Where are the cannon?" He goes, "Oh, those cannon." 2 6-pounders in the back. They dig up the 2 6-pounders in the carriages that they sit on. They put the cannon upright, and they break off the trunnions that allow them to be used. And they take those cannons and throw them in the river. And they take the carriages and they pile it in the center of town with whatever else they've deemed unworthy of the king, and they light it on fire. That fire quickly spreads. At the time, the way that people in New England attempted to add waterproofing to their roof was to put tar on it. Very quickly, this fire spreads to a nearby house and spreads to the roof. And the tar roof began to flame. The very young 87-year-old lady of the house comes out and goes to Colonel Smith, goes to him directly and says, "Do you intend to burn down my home?" At this point, we are not at peace, nor are we at war. Colonel Smith forms up his men for a bucket brigade. They start taking water from the local well and putting a bucket brigade together, start throwing water on top of this roof. And as anybody who's ever burned a tire knows, what happens when you take rubber or tar and start it on fire and then start throwing water on it, you get this really big, nasty black smoke. Sitting in Punkatassett Hill are now 500 militia. Those 500 militia have gathered, waiting for orders. They have chosen a leader, a blacksmith. His name is Captain Isaac Davis. Captain Isaac Davis, another veteran, well off for the time, has money to spare, enough even to make bayonets for other people and donate them to the cause. He also has a family. He has a wife and 3 kids. 3 daughters, to be precise. And on that very morning, when the alarm listers came and knocked on his door and told him that the regulars are out, his wife is at home, and he is at home, and their 3 daughters are at home, and all 3 of his daughters are ill. Very sick, actually. Captain Isaac Davis will answer a call to defend his people. He will answer the call to defend his liberties and his freedoms. Captain Isaac Davis will pick up his musket, and will make for the door. Before he exits his house, he will turn back to his wife, and he says, "Take care of the children." These are the last words he'll ever say to his wife. Captain Isaac Davis is sitting on the top of Punkatassett Hill, where the city elders have chosen him to command and to lead. The city elders see in the distance the black smoke coming from Concord. And they go to him and they ask him a fateful question. "Do you intend to let them burn down our town?" Captain Isaac Davis draws his sword and he says, "I have not a man who is afraid to go." Earlier tonight, a question was asked about the veterans. Several of you in the room. I talked to lots of veterans. Both of my brothers today are active duty. One of my brothers spent 2 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan. He's a field medic. And I asked him this question. I said, "Were you afraid?" And he said, "The only people who aren't afraid in battle are those who are dead or idiots, and those tend to be dead too." Some folks may disagree with me, but that was his perspective. Listen to what Captain Isaac Davis said. He did not say they were not afraid. He said, we are not afraid to go. Those men have wives at home, sons at home, daughters at home. They have a family. They have their own lands. They have their life. They have some liberties. Was it enough? They had to ask the question, will we fight for our liberties, or will we be slaves to a tyrannical government? They had to ask that question of themselves. Remember in 1775, there's no Obamacare to get you in the hospital to fix you up. In fact, healthcare in general pretty much equaled leeches, alcohol, and bone saws. When you got shot, gangrene was likely. If you were injured, there's no Red Cross, there's no medical insurance. If your house is burnt down, there's no State Farm. They are putting everything on the line for their freedoms and the freedom of their families. Captain Isaac Davis takes this challenge, he takes his men, and he marches towards the North Bridge. This is south of Punkatasset Hill, still northwest of Concord. As he marches his men down to the North Bridge, there's 2 units of the regulars already there. This battle starts the same way many battles of the day started. Not with musket fire, but with insults. They yell back and forth at each other. Smelly Americans, damn lobsterbacks, whatever they had for insults of the day, back and forth. Very quickly, however, the regulars feel themselves to be surrounded and they open fire on the Americans. The Americans are almost entirely on foot. One of them is not. Regulars had a particular way of using their firearms in 1775. Present! Fire! Present! Fire! They would look away. Why? Big powder flash. Oof. They didn't want to be blind. Professional soldier didn't like that. He would look away. And as a good marksman instructor would tell you, if you look away, what happens to your muzzle? It goes up. The Americans had a different way of managing their firearms. Present. Aim. Fire. Colonials lived off their muskets. They ate off their muskets. If you want to eat, you need to hit your target. Be it a bunny, or a deer, or anything in between. They had to be good marksmen. The opening volley goes high from the regulars. In fact, many of the colonists will write that they could hear the ball whizzing by their head. One man sits on a horse, Captain Isaac Davis. He takes a shot directly to the heart. He falls from his horse. He hits the ground dead. Major Buntrock, another commander in the field, runs to him, looks at him, finds him dead, and he reacts. He looks to his own men and he says, "Fire! For God's sakes, fire as fast as you can." In the next 2 minutes, the American colonists will open hell on the British. 44% of the British officers will hit the ground dead or dying in 2 minutes' time. The rest of the regulars will break. They throw their muskets, they throw their big hats, and they run as fast as their little red shoes can take them, all the way back to Concord. Compare that to the morning of Lexington. In Lexington, 17 American colonials dead or dying on the green. The regulars have taken 0 casualties. Many historians would probably love to argue this with me, but I will submit to you, if the first shot, a shot heard around the world, was fired by an American, I almost guarantee you there would have been a regular laying on the ground. At this point, we've had our second strike of the match. The first at Lexington Green, the second at the North Bridge. Colonel Smith will see his 2 units running back to him from the North Bridge, and all of a sudden he will realize he's in a lot of trouble. He forms up his men from the south side of town, from the north side of town, he pulls them together, and they start marching in good order back towards Boston. Remember how communication worked at this time. Mouth to ears. A little less. The Minutemen, those who have been called by the alarm listers throughout the morning, are starting to surround what today we call Battle Road. Men on the left, men on the right. Colonel Smith will send out 6 grenadiers to flank on the left, 6 grenadiers to flank on the right. Their purpose to keep the Americans outside of range. At this point, the Americans are not opening fire. They don't know what has happened. Colonel Smith and his men will find themselves marching back towards Boston with his flankers doing their job, keeping the Americans at bay, until they reach a small place called Miriam's Corner. You have a river that runs, and a bridge, and a quick left turn and a quick right turn to get to the other side of the river as the road runs along the river. As his men come up to the bridge, they will see about a dozen Americans standing on the bridge. Colonel Smith believes their purpose there is to cut them off from the retreat to Boston. He orders his men to fire. They see the 12 Americans standing on the bridge. They do not see the almost 2 companies of Americans in the hill behind them. The Americans on that hill have no commander. They have no order to fire. But they see their countrymen coming under fire, and they return fire. They open up themselves on the bridge. This is the 3rd strike of the match. First strike, Americans stand against a tyrannical government. The second strike, at the North Bridge, they return fire after being fired upon. The third strike, at Miriam's Corner, Americans firing upon an enemy in defense of their own country. From this point forward, Colonel Smith finds himself under fire every time his men stop. That morning, if you remember, he had woken up all those men at 1 in the morning, and they're all soaking wet from the chest on down. Well, there's one other little tidbit to go with that. That morning, they only had 1 canteen of fresh water with them. This is water. They also had the nastiest food that the Navy could possibly give them, because they didn't have any other rations. So they asked the Navy for rations, and rations came from the Navy, said, sure, we'll give you the most maggoty, crappy stuff that we have, because then you get to go out and use it. They only have one canteen of water, so Colonel Smith has to stop at every well and refill with water. Every time they stop, between Concord and Lexington, they find themselves under fire. That morning, the alarm listers had gone out, town to town, community to community. Again, the internet of 1775. In 16 hours' time, 14,000 militia will come to Battle Road. 14,000 people who have gone down to history without names, without glory for them, showed up in defense of their liberties, their freedom, and their countrymen. Compare that to now, today, 2014. Twitter, Facebook, cell phones, landlines, fax machines, anything, everything. How many people think you could get 14,000 people in one place in 16 hours if it meant defending their country today? Gives you an idea. Gives you an idea about the difference of liberties in the heart of people then to now. Colonel Smith finds himself under fire constantly. Colonel Smith will start his march towards Lexington. Before he gets there, he finds someone he does not expect, Captain Parker. Captain Parker that morning said, "Do not fire unless fired upon." He's got a different idea now. We're going to open fire. And we don't have 70 men, we've got a whole lot more. He puts himself right across the road, directly in front of the regular column, and opens across the column. Colonel Smith's horse will be shot out from underneath him. His men have to pick him up and drag him almost 100 yards before he can carry himself again. Major Pitcairn will take a ball in the hip. The men who are under their command, for the most part, break and run, throwing whatever they have that they can throw and running as fast as they can move back towards Lexington, where they find what they believe to be their savior. That morning, Colonel Smith was supposed to leave with 1,100 men. He left with 300, the 800 to follow, sitting in Lexington under the command of General Percy. Sits another 800 soldiers. And if you remember how I said what Major Pitcairn, his opinion of the Americans, General Percy has even a more flamboyant opinion. He said, previously to this event, he said, "Give me a single battalion. I will go across all of the Americas, gelding half of all of the men, half of them willingly, the other half with but a little force." At this point, General Percy sees Colonel Smith and his men running full bore into his own arms, and he honestly believes that these men have gone mad. He believes they have gone insane from the water. Quickly, he starts pulling them in, and he brings them into his troops. They surround his colonel's men, and they start asking them what's going on, and all of a sudden, General Percy's light bulb goes off when his scouts report that they can't tell the difference between the men and the trees. Those 14,000 militia are everywhere. Colonel Percy very quickly pulls together his men. They drop the 2 cannon they brought with them. They drop any extra shot they can, and they begin a full-out march as orderly and quickly as they can back towards Boston. He keeps Colonel Smith's men in the center of his lines in an attempt to try to keep them away from the fire. Now at this time, an American general, another gentleman who has gone down to history with little fanfare, his name is General Heath, will come on board. Anybody heard of General Heath? You guys choose. General Heath describes himself as a balding fat man. And I like to think that it's nice that I can look like a hero. describes himself as a balding fat man. He has spent years not being a soldier, but being a good man at the community. He's earned his title of general through work in the community. And at this time, though, he's exactly the person we needed. His hobby was to go to the local tavern and sit down with the regular officers and talk to them and say, so, if you did this, what would they do? If they did this, what would you do? He's devised himself a tactic. He's devised a tactic that he calls the moving circle of fire. His tactic works so well that the regulars, without ever hearing this name, will call it the exact same thing. General Heath has devised a tactic to inform the men ahead of him where the regulars are going, and to put men on horseback and ride them in front of the regulars. And what he is doing is he is making sure that the regulars stay under fire from the left, from the right, from the forward, and from the behind. General Percy, who has now taken command of Colonel Smith's men, marching eastward, where Colonel Smith found himself under fire every time he stopped, General Percy finds himself under fire every time he stops and every time he moves. General Percy will all-out run for Boston. At certain points, regular troops will take their muskets, throw them into rivers, take their hats, throw them to the ground, and run to the countryside. At one point, 6 grenadiers will be separated from their group and will actually go in search of anyone they can find to surrender to. They find themselves a little old lady, about 80 years old. Her name is Mother Bathrick. They find Mother Bathrick, and they almost throw their muskets at her. Please, we surrender to you. Mother Bathrick, of course, picks up one of the muskets, takes it in nice formation, and marches them to the local captain. And upon getting to the local captain, she says, now, you make sure to tell good King George that a little old lady captured 6 of his grenadiers. And believe it or not, the grenadiers actually write it up. They write it up in their very own after-action reports. And months later, as all of this is getting back to England, standing in the halls of Parliament will be a parliamentary senator holding up the news report saying, if a little old lady can take 6 of our grenadiers, how many men will it take to capture America? General Percy will be pursued on all sides, all the way back to Boston. There is an opportunity from another American general who has command of almost 1,400 men to get in between Percy and Boston. This American general is a patriot. He will serve with distinction. He will serve his country with his life in the Battle of Bunker Hill, or Breed's Hill. But on this day, he has decided that father should not fight son, that mother should not fight daughter. He believes that diplomacy can still take the day. He refuses to move his men until the evening falls. General Heath will pursue General Percy all the way back to Boston, where the thing that finally saves him is the thing that could have stopped most of the day's events, was the HMS Somerset. That same warship that Paul Revere rode right by early that morning, the guns of the HMS Somerset will stop the Army's advance for General Heath. And they will then blockade Boston and, in time, liberate Boston under the command of General Washington. This day, this one day, sets off the events of an 8-year-long war. An 8-year-long war that today, in our history books, is pretty much George Washington won stuff, John Hancock had big handwriting, and that's about all we know about it anymore. I give this presentation to people all over Minnesota. I'll go to other states if I can, but I've been mostly in Minnesota. Almost 550 people this year. The vast majority have never heard this story before. This is our history. This is our heritage. Why do we have the liberties we have today? It's because our forefathers made this sacrifice. Today it's very difficult to make that sacrifice. You've got a warm home, maybe an SUV, maybe two of them, indoor plumbing. Today, we find it very difficult to make any sacrifice, much less the ones that they made. John Adams would later write, the American Revolution was won before the first shot was ever fired. It was won in the hearts and minds of the American people before the first shot was ever fired. The founding fathers of our nation did not intend to have a revolutionary war. They intended to have a revolution of ideas, a revolution of the mind. John Adams also wrote, said, posterity, you will never know what it costs the present generation to secure your freedoms. Should you forget, I will repent in heaven that I took half the pains to secure them. In 1775, our forefathers, our foremothers, who stood on those battlefields, who put their families, their lives on the line for an 8-year war, only had one option to them. It was the bullet box. Their sacrifice has given us something much, much more powerful. That's the ballot box. The centerpiece of the Liberty Seed program, we want Americans to understand where they came from. We want Americans to know why they have the rights they have today. And we want Americans to get engaged, to sacrifice a little. We never, ever, ever want Americans taking up arms against Americans again. Never. But if we don't get involved in our government, we don't get involved in our communities, we don't get involved in our nation, that may end up where we stand. We do not want that to happen again. We want people to be involved. So I'm not going to stand here and tell you who to vote for. I know who I'm talking to. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. What I'm going to tell you is to get out and vote. Take part. Today's sacrifice doesn't have to be a ball in the chest. Today's sacrifice can be simply your time and a little bit of your personal fortune to get out and talk to other people. And maybe be something like me, put on a silly costume and go find people who want to listen to you. But get out there and go.
The grip of oppression, I fought for my liberty. I paid with the blood of my people.